The Holy Gospel according to John, the 11th chapter. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Then when she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did not I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Sign, sign, everywhere a sign, blocking out the scenery, breaking my mind. Do this, don't do that. Can't you read the sign? Some of us remember it. The 5-man electrical band many years ago sang this song about the ways that signs are used to draw limits, to exclude. The song took on the assumptions of the day that are often on the surface of human interaction. Long-haired, freaky people need not apply. Yet there is a different way that we can understand signs as well. It is apparent when certain things happen in people's lives and they are interpreted to have a meaning beyond that event itself. Sometimes we hear people interpret events of their lives as a sign that God is teaching them something. Other times we hear people identify what has happened as a sign of God's providence. Sign, sign, everywhere a sign. John's gospel speaks of signs as well. Whether it is Jesus turning water to wine at the wedding of Cana, that first of his signs, or Jesus giving sight to a blind man, the author offers these signs that Jesus is God present. Indeed, this is the unfolding of what the prologue to this gospel tells from the very beginning. Jesus is the Word of God enfleshed. Encounter with Jesus is encounter with the divine Word that was from the very beginning and through whom all things came into being. And today, Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is ill. What transpires brings heartbreak, despair even. Both of Lazarus' sisters come to Jesus separately, struggling to make sense of it all. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus enters into the weeping. But that is not the end of the story. Despair and heartbreak is not the end, the final word. Jesus proceeds to move to the place of burial despite the objections, the calls, and he calls for the stone to be rolled away. Now, when someone has been dead for 4 days, there's not much hope. And in fact, in that culture, they had a sense, they understood that the soul might hang around for 1 or 2 days, but after 3 days, all hope was gone. The soul had gone on to wherever it was going next. And yet, Jesus calls Lazarus back among the living. Bible scholars are careful to point out that this is less a resurrection than a revivification. However one defines the action, the end result is the same. It is similar to Ezekiel's dry bones in that valley. Where there is not hope, God is present. Indeed, God's presence changes everything and brings new life. Some call what happened a miracle. The author of John's Gospel, though, is careful to call it a sign. This sign points to the way that Jesus is divine presence. This sign is not the point. Rather, it points to who Jesus is, the Word of God embodied among humanity, bringing life and light, healing and wholeness. Even this promise is not the end of the story. When Lazarus comes out of the tomb wrapped in those strips of cloth, Jesus calls on the community to unbind him, to unwrap him. Here is the invitation to join in divine work. Too often when people have found themselves in a bad way, there can be a tendency among those around to know the story. And that story becomes defining for that person. In these parts, too often, if someone is of a certain family or has a certain history, we tend to think that we know everything about who they are and how things will go into their future. Call it stereotyping or typecasting. But whatever the reality, it is that sometimes the things that have bound people have become definitive by the community. What Jesus invites us to participate in is freedom. The community is called to see the sign and believe, to be sure. But more so, the community of Christ is called to actively see differently. In this, there is new life. There is freedom, healing, well-being. To be sure, all of that is God's work. And yet, the community of Christ is called to move from despair to embrace the promise and to respond to the invitation to see and to believe, to see and participate in unbinding Lazarus and all who are like him. Today we know too well that there is cause for despair, for heartbreak. It is still true. Today, through Christ, we also know that we have the promise of God's presence in the midst of it all. Today, we are invited to be partners in sharing that promise, telling the story, believing so that all may know the truth of love and forgiveness, healing and wholeness, well-being and new life. For Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life.